students. We're back with the second video in the series. We're going to do part 2 of French Lieutenant's Woman by John Fowles. So, in the previous video, we looked at the biographical details of the author and went into some detail on certain terms related to this work. Certain terms like postmodern literature, historiographic metafiction, and so on. I hope you've understood our previous lesson. So now we'll continue and continue into the work, and we will look at the major characters, and we will look at the plot summary of the novel. First of all, we have Sarah Woodruff, who is the protagonist. She is the titular character. She is the French lieutenant's woman. She is an educated woman, but she is born in the lower class of the society. She's a farmer's daughter. Her education allows her to work as a governess. That is, she stays with the family and teaches their kids. She's around 25 years old. But she is, because of this, she is neither in the lower class or in the upper class. That is, she has education, so she's somewhere hovering near the middle class, but because of birth, she is from a lower class, from the peasant class. So she does not belong to either place. And on top of this, Sarah Woodruff is seen as a fallen woman in the society where she lives. In Lyme Regis, she has a reputation of being an immoral woman because there is a rumor about her and a supposed lover that she has. So that is the case of Sarah Woodruff. Then we have Charles Henry Smithson, the second protagonist of this story. He's around 32 years old. He is a member of the nobility, but he's not very rich. His father's fortune has diminished. His uncle has a considerable fortune, and it is said that he will stand to get it. But let's see whether he does get it or not. He has a manservant who follows him around constantly. He's actually a Londoner, but he's living in Lyme Regis for some reasons, actually to be with his fiancée. He has an interest in paleontology, which is the study of fossils. So he's a very bookish sort of person. And, he's not really like the other members of the upper class in which he's a member. For example, his uncle loves fox hunting, but Charles does not have that interest. He is more into reading and into collecting fossils. So he is also a bit of an outcast. Like Sarah Woodruff, he doesn't really fit into the society in which he lives. Now we have Sam Farrow, who is one of the main characters. Sam is Charles's manservant, so kind of like a butler. He constantly follows Charles around, making sure he has everything he needs. So Charles has a love interest called Mary, who is working in a family home, and he is born into the lower class, but he wants to climb the social ladder and become a rich person by opening a shop, a haberdashery. A haberdashery is a place which sells sewing items like needles, thread, other items that is needed for stitching clothes. So he wants to open that shop and become rich, and he hopes that Charles will give him the money. But we reach a certain point in the novel where it is doubtful whether Charles will be able to provide the money. So Sam actually goes into he hatches a plan in order to make sure that Charles marries into money, and so that he can benefit from it, so that Sam can benefit from it. He even later tries to kind of blackmail Charles to get money from him. And he might be seen as you might think he's a villain, but he's actually doing this in order to advance in life. He's essentially not a bad person. He's just doing what is needful in order to survive. So it's kind of a commentary on the Victorian society where a hard-working man like Sam Farrow cannot advance in life or cannot gain social mobility without resorting to certain unfair means. Next, we have Dr. Grogan, who is a doctor and a friend of Charles. They have several common interests. They have similar intellectual pursuits. They both are interested in Darwin's theory of evolution. And Grogan has certain opposing ideas regarding Sarah. So, Grogan and Charles don't see eye to eye when it comes to Sarah. Charles is very much sympathetic towards her, whereas Grogan thinks that she's a kind of a twisted person. She's actually trying to manipulate Charles with her sad story. And, Charles is playing a dangerous game by falling in love with her. That is Grogan's opinion. So he is also not harshly judging Sarah because he's a bad person. He is giving his opinion based on his understanding of life or his understanding of society. So we cannot say that he's an antagonist. His arguments act as an opposition to Charles's. They are two sides of a coin. We can think of Grogan as an opposite to Charles. Now we have the narrator. In our first lecture, I mentioned that even though most of the novel is narrated in the omniscient point of view, that is with the third person narrator, in between the narrator does show up in the plot as a character. So he sort of inserts himself into the scene, but we cannot really say that this is John Fowles himself. The narrator suggests that he is the writer of the story, and he talks about his process of writing. But he also says that he is not completely in control of his characters and what they do. He doesn't know everything about them. But, we cannot say that he is the writer himself, because John Fowles is a man who lived in 1967 England. But the narrator is shown as a grown man who lives in Victorian England. So we can say that he's an alter ego. The narrator is an alter ego or a version of the author, but not exactly the author. And he is kind of judgmental and pretentious, and he believes that the entire world is his, that he can do anything he wants, which is sort of true because he is he's a representative of the writer. We can call it that. The narrator figure is there to satirize himself. Fowles uses the narrator figure to satirize himself. And to show us that fiction is a construction of the author's mind. Now we have Ernestina Freeman, who is lovingly called Tina by Charles. She is the fiancée of Charles. She comes from an upper middle class family, but she's not a member of the nobility. She is from a wealthy family, but she does not have noble blood. She's not an aristocrat. And her family is actually much wealthier than Charles. But she does feel a kind of an anxiety about the status difference. So even though she has money, she is not an aristocrat. And that fact gives her some anxiety. And she's jealous. She doesn't want Charles to be with anybody else. She loves him a lot. She's an only child. She's a little bit spoiled. And she is a very conventional person, a very traditional, very orthodox person. She conforms to every societal norm set out by the Victorian society in which she is living. She does not think outside of the box. She's not a free thinker. She does not want to break away from the box within which the society has placed her. She's a very she conforms to the society. She is happy where she is. So she's an extreme contrast to Charles, because Charles is always thinking. Charles is thinking about society, thinking about life itself, and he understands that the life that is available, that the life that is there for him in Lyme Regis is not exactly what he wants. He feels smothered by the society in which he lives, and this is eventually the reason why there is a friction between Ernestina and Charles. There is a fissure in their relationship. They do not finally they do not end up together. This is because Ernestina is a very traditional, very orthodox person, and Charles feels kind of smothered by her presence. He feels like if he marries her, it'll be like living in a prison for the rest of his life. And we have Mary, who is a maid at Mrs. Tranter's house. Mrs. Tranter is actually Ernestina's aunt. She is also a poor. She comes from a very poor person, poor family. She is a pretty woman, and she is in love with Sam. Sam, like we mentioned before, is Charles's manservant. So their love story is also a parallel plot line that happens throughout the novel. Then we have Mrs. Poltney. Mrs. Poltney is an upper class woman who lives in Lyme, and she's a very mean person. She has a lot of servants. She mistreats them. She's very religious, very extremely religious, and she wants everybody to be as religious as she is. And in the beginning of chapter 4, there's a description about Mrs. Poltney, her house, her servants, how she treats those people. She is very mean and very cruel to all of them, and she always judges people based on her perception of religion. She thinks that people are immoral. She always doubts whether people are up to no good, and she makes a show of her faith, and she performs a lot of charitable actions, gives a lot of charity, but it's kind of like a competition for her. She wants to do more charity than this other character called Lady Cotton. That is why she does charity. And she is a symbol for the hypocrisy of the Anglican Church. And she is afraid that she will go to hell when she dies. And the narrator, when she actually does die, the narrator does a description of how she descends into hell. Her soul descends into hell, and the narrator kind of takes pleasure in putting Mrs. Poltney in hell. And now we have Mr. Freeman, who is the father of Ernestina. He has made a fortune through his store on Oxford Street. It's a tailoring shop. And he's a nouveau riche. What is a nouveau riche? A person who has just become rich, and they are trying to fit in with the actual rich people, actual blue bloods of the society. And he tries to be a gentleman, and he wants to marry off his daughter to an aristocrat so that she will get a title. She will become part of the aristocracy. And he does not really get along with Charles, and they argue about several things. Mr. Freeman wants Charles to give him his business one day, but Charles does not want to work. He does not want to work in a business, and eventually, when the engagement is broken off, Mr. Freeman is very angry with him. We have the prostitute. Her name is also Sarah, incidentally. And Charles has a brief meeting with her. They don't really get into a physical relationship. Her name is also Sarah, and she's kind of a symbol, or she's a representative or a alternative for Sarah in terms of Charles's lust. Like, he wants to be with her and he wants to possess her, and this sex worker is a symbol of that. And she also has a little daughter with whom Charles plays with. The other Sarah, the original Sarah Woodruff, also has a daughter. Eventually, she has a daughter who belongs to Charles. So right now, when I'm giving descriptions of all these characters without talking about the plot, it might be confusing for you. But all of these will fall into place once we start to discuss the plot points. Now we have Mrs. Tranter, who is Ernestina's aunt and is actually a very nice person. So Ernestina is staying in Lyme because she has a supposed disease, a consumptive disease. And that's why she's staying there. And our protagonist Charles is staying there to keep company for Ernestina. He is actually from London, but he is living in Lyme Regis so that he can be closer to her. Mrs. Tranter is a very good person. She's an opposite to Mrs. Poltney. She treats her servants very well. She sees them as actual people and not as slaves. And Ernestina often tries to rebel against her aunt, but Charles really likes her. Let's look at some of the minor characters. One is Sir Robert, who is Charles's uncle, and Charles was hoping to inherit his estate because Sir Robert was a bachelor for most of his life. So Charles thought that after his time he will get the estate, he will get his considerable inheritance. But Sir Robert gets the idea to get married, and once if he has a child, Charles would not get the inheritance, and this jeopardizes Charles's future. Then we have Mrs. Fairley, who is a very cruel housekeeper who works for Mrs. Poltney. She also takes pleasure in torturing Sarah and eventually gets Sarah fired. Then we have the vicar and the curate, two clergymen. For the first one, the vicar serves Mrs. Poltney, and he humors her because she gives a lot of money to his church, but he actually doesn't like her. Then the curate is a clergyman who at one point Charles goes into a church to pray in Exeter, and the curate is the one who is at the church. Then we have Millie, one of the servants of Mrs. Poltney. She is very close to Sarah. Then Mrs. Hawkins, a servant at Vincent. So Vincent is the place where Sir Robert lives, that is Charles's uncle lives. So she's a servant there. Then Mrs. Endicott, she's a hotel owner. And we have a few more minor characters. These people are not very important. Sir Thomas Burgh is an old college friend of Charles. Then we have Harry Montague, Charles's lawyer. Mr. Aubrey, Mr. Freeman's lawyer. Then we have Sergeant Murphy. So these lawyers and Sergeant Murphy come into play when the engagement between Ernestina and Charles are broken off, and Mr. Freeman forcibly makes him sign a document, and these lawyers are involved when that happens. Then Lalag, who is Charles and Sarah's daughter. And finally, Mrs. Talbot, a person who used to employ Sarah, and she is also a very helpful person. So now we have a few pictures of Lyme Regis. So as I mentioned, it is a seaside town in Dorset. So it's a very beautiful place, and Sarah is living there to recover from her disease. So even now, Lyme Regis is a very beautiful place.